Before the roads crossed southern Florida, before the canals were cut and the cities rose along the coasts, before the drainage projects changed the direction of the water, there was only the slow, quiet movement of a river that did not look like a river at all. It spread across the land in a shallow sheet, barely knee-deep in most places, moving almost imperceptibly toward the sea. It covered hundreds of miles of low, flat terrain. It carried no strong current, made no dramatic sounds, left no obvious marks on the landscape that an untrained eye could follow. And yet it was one of the most complex, layered, and ancient water systems in North America. This is the Everglades, not a swamp, not a marsh, not simply a flooded plain, something older and stranger than any of those names quite captures. And if you enjoy these quiet journeys into forgotten landscapes of American history, you can find more of them by subscribing to History Sleepy Time, where the past rests just beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. Imagine standing somewhere in the interior of southern Florida, far from any road before sunrise. The air is warm and thick. The sawgrass, that sharp, tall, ancient grass that covers so much of the Everglades, barely moves. The water around your feet is dark and still, reflecting the last of the night sky. Somewhere in the distance, a bird calls once and then falls silent. There is nothing here that announces itself as remarkable, and that is part of what makes this place so quietly extraordinary. Because beneath your feet, beneath the shallow water and the mat of roots and the layers of soft dark peat, the land descends into something much older. Limestone, pale, porous, ancient limestone, stretches beneath the entire peninsula of Florida. It is riddled with channels and cavities. It holds water and releases it slowly. It dissolves over long periods of time, creating caves and sinkholes and underground passages that connect the surface world to a hidden system far below. Beneath the Everglades is not simply more Everglades. Beneath the Everglades is a geological record that stretches back millions of years. There are buried shorelines from when the sea stood higher than it does today. There are layers of sediment carrying pollen from forests that no longer exist. There are the bones of animals that walked these lands long before any human being arrived in the Americas. There are traces of human habitation, shell middens, fire hearths, buried canoe trails, the remains of villages, preserved beneath the water and the peat as carefully as anything a museum could hold. The question of what really lies beneath the Everglades is not a question that leads to a single dramatic answer. It is a question that opens into many layers. And to understand those layers, we have to begin at the beginning, not with the Everglades as it appears today, but with the land itself and the long, slow process that created it. Florida is one of the youngest landmasses in North America in terms of its emergence from the sea. That is worth sitting with for a moment. The limestone that forms the foundation of the entire state, that pale, soft rock beneath every highway and every backyard and every stretch of wetland, was built in shallow tropical seas. For tens of millions of years, long before Florida existed as dry land at all, marine creatures lived and died in warm, clear water over what is now the southeastern United States. Their shells and skeletons accumulated on the seafloor. Over time, under pressure, those accumulated layers of shell and sediment compressed into rock. That rock is limestone, and it is the foundation of everything. Scientists studying the geology of southern Florida have found limestone layers that extend hundreds of feet below the modern surface. Some of these layers preserve the fossils of marine organisms that lived in warm, shallow seas during periods so ancient that the continents were arranged differently than they are today. The limestone of Florida is, in a very real sense, a record of a vanished ocean. But Florida did not always sit beneath the sea. During cooler periods in Earth's history, particularly during the ice ages of the Pleistocene epoch, which lasted from roughly 2.5 million years ago to about 12,000 years ago, large quantities of seawater became locked up in glaciers across the northern parts of the world. Sea levels fell, not everywhere at once, and not dramatically from one year to the next, but over thousands of years, the global ocean dropped by significant amounts, sometimes by more than 300 feet below its modern level. When sea levels fell, land that had previously been submerged was exposed. Florida grew larger. At the peak of the last major glacial period, roughly 20,000 years ago, southern Florida extended significantly further into what is now the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. The coastline was not where it is today. What is now shallow offshore water was, at that time, dry land. Forests grew there, animals walked there. And people, the first inhabitants of this part of North America, may have lived and traveled across landscapes that are now permanently submerged beneath the sea. This is one of the first layers of the hidden world beneath the Everglades, and it lies offshore rather than underfoot, but it is essential to understanding everything that follows. Because the Everglades, as we know, it is not an ancient landscape in geological terms. It is a relatively young one. The particular arrangement of wetlands, sawgrass prairies, shallow freshwater sloughs, mangrove coastlines, and tropical hammocks that defines the modern Everglades began to take shape only after the last great ice age ended, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, when sea levels rose and the climate of southern Florida became wetter and warmer. Before that transformation, the landscape of southern Florida looked completely different. Picture a dry, open savanna, not the wet, lush world of the Everglades, but a drier, cooler landscape with scrubby vegetation, sandy flats, and exposed limestone ridges. The kind of landscape where mastodons and mammoths could graze. Where giant ground sloths moved slowly through open ground. Where camels, yes, camels, now long vanished from North America, once lived alongside horses and tapirs and a dozen other large animals that have no modern equivalent on this continent. This was Florida during the late Pleistocene, the period from roughly 50,000 years ago to about 12,000 years ago. Paleontologists and archaeologists have found evidence of this world throughout Florida, and some of it has come from the rivers and springs and shallow waters of the Everglades region itself. Bones of mastodons, mammoths, giant sloths, and other large Pleistocene animals have been recovered from riverbeds and from the edge of springs across southern and central Florida. These are not surface finds, they are buried beneath layers of sediment that tell a story of gradual change. The springs deserve particular attention. Florida is famous for its natural springs, places where groundwater under pressure rises to the surface through vents in the limestone, creating clear, cool, constant temperature pools and streams. These springs were important to animals and people throughout Florida's history. But they are also, in a sense, windows into the geological past. Scientists studying Florida's springs have found, in the sediment layers around and beneath them, evidence of environments that no longer exist: pollen from ancient forests, bones of extinct animals, stone tools left by the earliest inhabitants. In some cases, springs that are now submerged, their vents and chambers sitting beneath modern water, preserve exceptionally well-protected evidence of Pleistocene and early Holocene occupation. The Osceola River, north of the Everglades region, but still within the broader Florida geological system, has been particularly revealing. Underwater archaeologists working in the river channel have recovered mastodon remains and stone tools in the same sediment layers, suggesting that the people who first arrived in Florida hunted these large animals in a landscape that looked very different from anything alive today. This research continues. Much of it remains incomplete. The underwater conditions make excavations slow and difficult, and the sheer age of some of these sites, some reaching back 10,000 years or more, means that the evidence is fragmented. But what has been found is enough to confirm something important. The people who first lived in what is now Florida arrived in a world that was already changing. They were not stepping into a stable, finished landscape. They were entering a peninsula that was slowly being reshaped by rising seas and a shifting climate, a world where familiar coastlines would eventually disappear beneath the ocean, and where dry lands would slowly fill with water. Over thousands of years, that transformation would produce the Everglades. The transition from the dry Pleistocene landscape to the wet Holocene wetlands of southern Florida was not a single event. It was a long, slow, irregular process, full of variation, pauses, reversals, and accelerations, driven by the gradual warming of the global climate and the steady rise of sea levels as glaciers melted. Researchers who study this period of Florida's environmental history work with something called paleoenvironmental evidence, physical traces preserved in sediment layers that allow them to reconstruct what the landscape looked like at different points in the past. The tools of this research include pollen analysis, which tracks what plants were growing in a given area based on microscopic pollen grains preserved in layers of sediment or peat. They include sediment core sampling, in which scientists extract long cylinders of compressed material from the bottom of lakes or wetlands and analyze the layers within them like pages of a book. They include radiocarbon dating, which can establish the age of organic material with considerable precision. And they include the analysis of plant remains, animal bones, and microscopic organisms preserved within these layers. What this research has revealed about southern Florida is a story of extraordinary environmental change compressed into a relatively short period of geological time. Roughly 10,000 years ago, as the climate warmed and sea levels continued to rise, the freshwater systems of southern Florida began to expand. Springs that had been modest features in a dry landscape became more active as the water table rose. Low areas began to hold water for longer periods. Plants that required standing water, the early ancestors of the sawgrass and aquatic vegetation that now define the Everglades, began to colonize these areas. Peat began to form. Peat is one of the most important materials in the hidden world beneath the Everglades, and it deserves a careful introduction. When plants grow in standing water and then die, they do not always decompose fully. In waterlogged, low-oxygen conditions, plant material can accumulate faster than it breaks down. Layer after layer of partially decomposed plant matter builds up over centuries and millennia, creating thick deposits of a soft, dark, organic material called peat. Peat is both a record and an archive. It preserves what it surrounds: pollen, seeds, insect remains, fragments of animal bone, and occasionally the tools or organic remains left by human beings. It also records time, because peat accumulates gradually and its layers can be dated. A deep peat core extracted from the Everglades carries within it a continuous environmental history of the region, a layer-by-layer account of which plants dominated, how wet conditions were, what lived and died in this place, and when each change occurred. Scientists studying Everglades peat have found deposits several feet deep in some areas, accumulations representing thousands of years of environmental history. The deepest layers date to the early Holocene, the period after the last ice age, when the wetland system was just beginning to form. Higher layers record periods of drought and flood, changes in vegetation, and the gradual development of the modern Everglades ecosystem. And within some of those peat layers, researchers have found traces of human presence, not monuments, not dramatic ruins. Subtle things, charcoal layers that indicate ancient fires, microscopic changes in pollen ratios that suggest people were modifying the vegetation, occasional fragments of worked bone or plant material. The people were here, living within and alongside this slowly transforming landscape, long before the Everglades became what we think of when we hear that name today. There is a particular quality to the Everglades that makes it difficult to understand from a distance. It looks from an aerial photograph or a map like a single, relatively uniform thing, a great green and blue expanse covering the southern tip of Florida. But within that expanse, there are dozens of distinct environments, each with its own character, its own water behavior, its own community of living things. There are the broad sawgrass prairies, the most iconic image of the Everglades, where the sharp, tall grass stretches to every horizon, broken only by scattered tree islands called hammocks. There are the deeper sloughs, channels of slightly deeper water where fish move and alligators rest, and the water flows just a little more freely toward the sea. There are the cypress swamps, shaded and cathedral-like, where the trees grow in water and send their distinctive knobbed roots up through the surface. There are the coastal mangrove forests, where salt water and fresh water meet and mix, and where the dense, interlocking roots of the mangrove trees build new land from sediment. And there are the Florida Bay and the coastal shallows, that final, shallow, biologically rich transition zone between the land and the open sea. Each of these environments has its own history. Each has its own relationship to the underlying limestone. And each contains its own buried record of what came before. The hammocks, those elevated tree islands rising just a foot or two above the surrounding water, are particularly interesting from an archaeological perspective. Because they offered dry ground in an otherwise wet landscape, they were natural gathering places for people. Archaeological surveys of Everglades hammocks have found evidence of human occupation at many of them, including shell fragments, pottery sherds, and the remnants of fires. Some hammocks appear to have been occupied repeatedly over many centuries, but the hammocks are also places where the relationship between the land and the water is most clearly visible. Stand on a hammock and look at the water surrounding you. The sawgrass extends in every direction. The water is shallow and slow, and yet the hammock you are standing on feels different, slightly higher, slightly denser, slightly older. It is not simply a random rise in the terrain. In many cases, the hammocks of the Everglades are underlain by ancient geological features, ridges in the limestone bedrock, or accumulations of organic material, or both, that have kept them slightly above the surrounding water for a very long time. The landscape has memory. And that memory is written in rock, in sediment, in peat, and in the arrangement of living things across the surface of the water. Beneath the peat and the sediment, beneath the rooted world of the sawgrass and the hammocks and the mangrove coastlines, the limestone continues. And the limestone has its own hidden world. Florida sits atop one of the most extensive karst landscapes in North America. Karst is a geological term for terrain shaped primarily by the dissolution of soluble rock, in Florida's case, limestone. Over millions of years, slightly acidic groundwater slowly dissolves limestone from within, creating an underground landscape of channels, cavities, caves, and sinkholes. The result is a rock that looks solid from the outside, but is anything but solid within. Florida's karst system is connected to a vast underground reservoir of water called the Floridan Aquifer, one of the most productive aquifer systems in the world. This aquifer underlies the entire state and extends into neighboring states as well. It holds enormous quantities of fresh water within its porous limestone chambers. It feeds the natural springs that have always been central to the life of the Florida Peninsula, and it connects the surface world of the Everglades to a hidden subsurface world that operates on its own slow, quiet schedule. The relationship between the Everglades and the underlying aquifer is not simple. In some areas, the Everglades actually sits above the aquifer, and water from the wetlands recharges the aquifer by slowly seeping downward through the limestone. In other areas, the aquifer water rises toward the surface, contributing to the Everglades from below. The exact nature of this exchange, how much water moves in each direction, how quickly, and what determines the balance, is something that scientists continue to study. What is clear is that the Everglades is not simply a surface phenomenon. The water that moves slowly across the sawgrass prairie is connected, through the limestone, to water that moves in darkness far below. The springs that emerge in rivers and bays around the edges of the Everglades are windows into that underground world. And the sinkholes that occasionally open in Florida's landscape, sometimes dramatically and suddenly, sometimes slowly over years, are reminders that the ground beneath the surface is hollow in places, shaped by processes that have been operating for millions of years. This hidden geological world is one reason why the Everglades behaves the way it does, why its water levels respond to rainfall across a vast area, why changes in land use far to the north can affect water quality in the southern wetlands, why the system is so difficult to manage and so easy to damage. The Everglades is not a closed system. It is connected underground to the entire peninsula. And the people who first learned to live within this landscape, the people who came to understand it most deeply, understood this connection in ways that took modern scientists many decades to fully appreciate. The water was already rising when the first people arrived in southern Florida, not rising in any way they could have measured or named, not rising in the span of a single life or even several generations, but rising slowly and continuously over centuries, reshaping the coastlines, flooding low ground, pushing the edge of the sea further and further inland. The people who lived through this long transformation did not experience it as a catastrophe. They experienced it as the world, the only world they knew, and they adapted to it with a depth of understanding that still commands the attention of researchers today. The question of when human beings first arrived in Florida is one that archaeologists continue to refine. The broad picture is this: the ancestors of the indigenous peoples of North America arrived on the continent from Northeast Asia, crossing a land bridge, or perhaps traveling by water along a coastal route during a period when sea levels were low enough to expose land that is now submerged beneath the Bering Sea. This migration, or series of migrations, took place during the late Pleistocene, and the descendants of those earliest arrivals gradually spread across both North and South America over thousands of years. By at least 14,000 years ago, and possibly earlier, people were present in various parts of North America. The exact timing and routes of this migration are still debated among researchers, and new evidence continues to revise our understanding. What is not debated is that by the time the last ice age was ending, roughly 12 to 10,000 years ago, people were living in Florida. We know this from physical evidence. At sites like the Page-Ladson site in the Orcilla River of northern Florida, archaeologists working underwater have recovered stone tools and mastodon remains from sediment layers that have been reliably dated to more than 14,000 years ago. The evidence suggests that people were interacting with large Pleistocene animals in Florida during a period when the landscape was very different from today, drier, cooler, and more open than the subtropical wetlands that would come later. Southern Florida, the region that would eventually become the Everglades, was also inhabited during this early period, though the evidence is harder to access. Much of the coastal territory where the earliest inhabitants would have lived is now submerged beneath the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic, lost when sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. Whatever camps, tools, and traces of habitation were left along those ancient coastlines have been sitting underwater for thousands of years, in many cases buried under additional layers of marine sediment. This is one of the great challenges of Florida archaeology. The most accessible evidence from the earliest periods of human occupation is often the evidence that was left furthest from the coast, on slightly higher ground, near inland water sources, in places that the rising sea did not reach. And even that evidence is frequently found underwater today, preserved in the bottoms of rivers and springs that have been slowly filling with sediment for millennia. What emerges from this archaeological picture is the outline of a people. We do not know their names, their languages, or how they understood themselves, who lived as highly mobile hunters, foragers, and fishers across a peninsula that was actively transforming beneath them. They followed game. They gathered plant foods. They used the springs and rivers as sources of clean water. And as the climate warmed and the wetlands spread, they adapted, shifting their movements, their technologies, and their relationships with the land to meet a world that was always changing. Over thousands of years, out of this long process of adaptation, the distinct cultures of southern Florida would emerge. By around 5,000 years ago, and continuing through the following millennia, the archaeological record of southern Florida becomes considerably richer. The climate had stabilized into something close to its modern form. The sea level had risen to approximately its current position, give or take. The Everglades ecosystem, the shallow freshwater wetlands, the coastal mangroves, the rich marine environments of Florida Bay and the Gulf Coast, was established and productive. And the people living within and around this ecosystem were becoming more settled, more regionally specific, and more archaeologically visible. Two cultures in particular define the ancient history of what is now the Everglades region. The first is the Calusa, a name that refers to the indigenous people who occupied the southwest coast of Florida, the Florida Keys, and much of the interior of southern Florida for at least 2,000 years before European contact, and almost certainly much longer. The second is the Tequesta, a people who inhabited the southeast coast of Florida, centered around what is now the Miami area, the area of the modern Everglades' eastern edge. These were not the only peoples in the region. Other groups, sometimes referred to collectively by archaeologists under names based on the ceramic traditions or geographic areas they represent, also lived throughout the peninsula. And the boundaries between these groups, their relationships with one another, and the degree to which the names we use accurately reflect ancient identities are all questions that archaeologists and historians approach with appropriate caution. But the Calusa and the Tequesta, because of the richness of the archaeological record associated with them, offer the most detailed picture we have of ancient life in the Everglades region. And that picture is remarkable. The Calusa are, in many ways, one of the most extraordinary examples of cultural complexity in North American prehistory. In most parts of the world, the development of complex societies with social hierarchies, political structures, large-scale public works, and long-distance trade, is associated with agriculture. The conventional model holds that people needed the surplus food production that farming provides in order to support the kind of specialized, non-farming population that complex societies require. The Calusa complicate that model. They were not farmers. there is no evidence that the Calusa cultivated crops in any significant way. Their food came from the sea, from the rivers, from the wetlands, fish, shellfish, turtles, birds, deer, and plant foods gathered from the wild. And yet, by the time European explorers made contact with them in the 16th century, the Calusa had developed a society that was, by any reasonable measure, highly complex. They had a paramount chief, a leader who held authority over a large territory and commanded tribute from subject communities across a wide area. They had a social hierarchy that distinguished between nobility, commoners, and enslaved captives. They had specialized craftspeople who produced elaborate ceremonial objects. They had a developed religious and ceremonial life, and they built, with great investment of labor and organization, large and impressive architectural features that transformed the landscape of their territory. How was this possible without agriculture? The answer lies in the extraordinary biological richness of the southwestern Florida coast. The shallow coastal waters, the estuaries, the mangrove forests, and the nearshore reefs of this region supported, and still support, though in diminished form, enormous quantities of fish and shellfish. Mullet, snook, redfish, sea trout, and dozens of other species were available in vast numbers at certain times of year, and could be harvested in ways that produced genuine abundance. Shellfish, oysters, clams, conch, and others were available year-round and could be collected in quantities that easily sustained large populations. The Calusa understood this environment with extraordinary precision. They built fish traps, complex arrangements of wooden stakes and woven materials set in the shallow coastal waters that could intercept and hold large quantities of fish. They built canals that connected coastal and interior water bodies, allowing them to move efficiently across a landscape that was otherwise difficult to navigate. They built their villages on elevated platforms made in part from the accumulated shells of the animals they ate, creating, over generations, artificial islands that rose above the surrounding water and were safe from flooding. These shell mounds are among the most visible and well-studied features of the ancient Calusa landscape, and they are, in the most literal sense, built from the hidden world. Every shell in a Calusa mound was once a living animal, a creature of the sea or the estuary pulled from the water, its mate consumed, its shell added to the growing heap. Over centuries and millennia, these accumulations became substantial. Some Calusa shell mounds rise 10, 15, even 30 feet above the surrounding water. Some cover multiple acres. Some contain within their layers not just shells, but the bones of fish and animals, fragments of pottery, wooden objects, and human burials. One of the most extensively studied of these is Mound Key, located in Estero Bay on the southwest coast of Florida. Mound Key is an island, almost entirely artificial, made up of shell deposits accumulated over at least 2,000 years of Calusa occupation. It covers more than 100 acres and rises in some places to more than 30 feet above sea level. Archaeological research at Mound Key has found evidence of large buildings, including what may have been the residence of the Calusa paramount chief. Spanish explorers who visited the area in the 16th century described a great chief's house large enough to hold 2,000 people, and archaeological evidence at Mound Key is consistent with the presence of very large structures. Mound Key is also the likely location of an early Spanish mission, one of several attempts by Spanish missionaries to establish a presence among the Calusa, which ultimately failed. The Calusa resisted Spanish authority and Christian conversion with remarkable consistency and effectiveness, and the story of their resistance is one of the most dramatic and least known chapters of early American history. But before we arrive at that chapter, we need to spend more time beneath the surface of what the Calusa built. The canal systems of the Calusa are among the most intriguing archaeological features of the Everglades region. Canals are not naturally occurring features in the Everglades landscape. They require planning, organization, and sustained labor to construct, and yet archaeological surveys using aerial photography, satellite imagery, and ground truthing have identified what appear to be the remnants of ancient canals in multiple locations across the southwestern Florida coast and interior. Some of these canals connect coastal bays and estuaries. Others appear to extend into the interior, providing access to freshwater resources or connecting different parts of the Calusa territory. Some are relatively short, others extend for miles. The construction of canals in a landscape like the southwestern Florida coast, where the terrain is low, wet, and dominated by mangroves and shallow water, required detailed knowledge of water levels, tidal patterns, and local geography. The Calusa would have needed to understand how water moved through their environment at different times of year, where the natural channels were, and how those channels could be modified or extended. This kind of knowledge is not written down. It is accumulated over generations, passed through observation and practice, embedded in the daily life of people who lived in close relationship with a complex water environment. Archaeological evidence for the canals is often subtle: a slight straightening of a natural channel, a consistent depth maintained over a distance that would not occur naturally, a raised bank on one or both sides. Some possible canals have been identified through the analysis of LiDAR data, light detection and ranging, a remote sensing technology that can penetrate vegetation to reveal the shape of the terrain beneath. LiDAR surveys of the southwestern Florida coast and nearby areas have revealed features in the landscape that are difficult to explain through natural processes alone, and that are consistent with deliberate human modification of the water environment. Researchers continue to study these features. Some interpretations remain contested. The challenge of distinguishing ancient human-made canals from natural channels that were simply used and maintained, or from channels that have been modified more recently, is significant. And the environmental conditions that make the Everglades so biologically rich also make it archaeologically difficult. The water, the peat, the vegetation, and the ongoing change in the landscape all work against the preservation and identification of ancient features. But the evidence that exists points toward a Calusa landscape that was not simply inhabited, it was engineered. Not in any dramatic or monumental sense that invites comparison to ancient empires or lost civilizations. Simply in the practical, intelligent, accumulated sense of a people who understood their environment well enough to modify it in ways that made it more productive, more navigable, and more sustainable across many generations. Beneath the Calusa shell mounds, archaeologists have found something unexpected. Not at all sites, and not always, but in enough cases to be significant. They have found water. Specifically, they have found evidence that some Calusa sites were built over or around fresh water, springs, or areas where fresh water seeped from the underlying limestone. In a coastal environment dominated by salt water, freshwater sources were critically important. Communities needed fresh water for drinking, for certain kinds of food preparation, and for the health of the people living within them. The presence of freshwater sources at or near major Calusa sites is unlikely to be coincidental. It suggests that the Calusa, in choosing where to build their largest and most permanent settlements, were selecting locations based in part on their access to the underlying hydrology, the hidden water system that moved through the limestone beneath the surface of the land and sea. This connection between surface settlement and underground water is something that researchers have noted at multiple Florida archaeological sites. The springs of Florida were not simply convenient amenities. They were, in many cases, central features around which communities organized themselves, sources of reliable, clean water that could sustain populations through dry periods and seasonal variation. And the springs themselves, as we have already seen, are windows into the geological past. Their cold, clear water, rising through the limestone from deep underground, carries a kind of memory, a temperature, a chemistry, a constancy that connects the living world above to the much older world below. The Tequesta of the southeastern coast present a somewhat different picture, shaped by a different environment, different available resources, and different historical circumstances. The Tequesta lived along the southeast coast of Florida and the Florida Keys, in the region that is now Miami-Dade County and the surrounding area. Their territory was bounded to the west by the Everglades, and they would have had regular interaction with the wetland environment and with the peoples who lived within it. Archaeological evidence for the Tequesta is in many ways harder to access than the evidence for the Calusa. The Miami metropolitan area, one of the largest urban centers in the southeastern United States, sits directly on top of much of the ancient Tequesta landscape. Development has destroyed or buried many archaeological sites. What survives is often fragmented, found in small windows opened by construction projects or in the deliberate surveys that preceded them. One of the most significant Tequesta archaeological finds in recent history came not from a dedicated excavation, but from a construction project. In 1998, during the preparation of a site in downtown Miami for a new development, workers uncovered a circular arrangement of post holes cut into the limestone bedrock. The circle was approximately 38 feet in diameter and contained 24 holes arranged in a regular pattern, with larger posts at the cardinal directions. Additional post holes and archaeological deposits were found nearby. This site, which became known as the Miami Circle, attracted enormous attention and significant controversy. The circular arrangement of post holes was unlike anything previously documented in Florida archaeology. Some researchers interpreted it as the foundation of a large circular building, consistent with the kind of structures that have been documented at other southeastern archaeological sites. Others pointed to the large posts at the cardinal directions as evidence of possible astronomical or ceremonial significance. A few popular accounts went considerably further in their interpretations, suggesting connections to other ancient cultures that the archaeological evidence does not support. What the careful archaeological analysis of the Miami Circle demonstrated is more modest but genuinely interesting. The site is a Tequesta archaeological site. The cut features in the limestone, the post holes, the basins, the shallow carvings are consistent with Tequesta construction techniques and cultural practices as understood from other sites and from historical accounts. The site dates to within the last 2,000 years, and possibly to a period fairly close to European contact. It appears to represent the location of a significant Tequesta building, possibly a chief's house or a structure with ceremonial importance, at a location near the mouth of the Miami River, which was one of the most important freshwater outlets on the southeast Florida coast. The Miami River connects the Everglades to the sea. At its western end, it begins in the broad, shallow freshwater wetlands. At its eastern end, it meets Biscayne Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. It is a short river by most measures, only a few miles long, but it occupies a position of critical importance in the geography of southern Florida, marking the place where the fresh water of the interior meets the salt water of the coast. The Tequesta understood this. Their principal village, described by Spanish explorers in the 16th and 17th centuries, was located at or near the mouth of this river. It was a place where fresh water and salt water, wetland and coast, interior and ocean all came together. And beneath the modern city that now occupies this location, beneath the streets and the buildings and the layers of urban development, the limestone still carries the carved marks of the people who lived here long before any of that existed. There is a word in the archaeological literature of southern Florida that appears again and again in discussions of the ancient landscape: midden. A midden is, in its simplest definition, a refuse heap. A place where people discarded the shells, bones, broken tools, ash, and other waste products of daily life. In most parts of the world, middens are modest features, small accumulations that tell archaeologists what a particular site's inhabitants were eating and using and discarding. In southern Florida, middens are something considerably more impressive, because the Calusa and Tequesta and their predecessors relied so heavily on shellfish, and because they occupied their sites for so long, their middens grew to extraordinary size. Some shell middens in southern Florida cover multiple acres and rise many feet above the surrounding terrain. Some contain the accumulated debris of thousands of years of occupation. And within that accumulated debris, preserved by the density of the shell and the chemistry of the surrounding material, are the traces of lives that would otherwise leave no record. Researchers studying Everglades area middens have found fish bones that tell them which species were being harvested and in what proportions across different periods. They have found plant remains that preserve evidence of diet and of the environments in which people were foraging. They have found the bones of land animals, deer, raccoon, turtle, bird, alongside the marine resources, giving a picture of a diet that drew from both the wetlands and the coast. They have found wooden objects, including canoe paddles and other tools, preserved in the anaerobic conditions deep within the midden deposits. And they have found human burials, often carefully placed, sometimes accompanied by objects that speak to beliefs about death and the continuation of the person beyond it. The wooden objects deserve special mention. Wood does not normally survive for thousands of years. It decays. It is consumed by insects and fungi and the processes of biological decomposition. In most parts of the world, the wooden tools and structures of ancient peoples have vanished entirely, leaving only the stone and ceramic and bone objects that resist decay. But in the waterlogged, low-oxygen conditions of the Everglades and the coastal southwest Florida sites, wood can be preserved for extraordinary lengths of time. Some of the most dramatic evidence of this comes from a site called Key Marco, located on Marco Island on the southwest Florida coast, which was excavated by a team under the direction of Frank Hamilton Cushing in the late 19th century. Cushing and his team recovered from a waterlogged midden deposit a remarkable array of wooden objects, masks, figurines, tools, fragments of nets and ropes, and other organic materials that had been preserved in the wet conditions for an estimated 2,000 years. The Key Marco objects are among the finest examples of ancient Florida woodworking ever found. They include a carved figure of a man-animal, part human, part crouching cat that has become one of the iconic images of Calusa art. They include masks painted with still vivid colors. They include practical objects, nets, ropes, handles that show the everyday technology of a people who relied on the sea. These objects are now housed in museums. But they came from beneath the surface of the Everglades coast, from the dark, waterlogged heart of a midden that had been accumulating since long before European contact. They are, in the most literal sense, a hidden world brought back into the light, and they raise an important question. If a single excavation in the late 19th century could recover objects of such quality and significance, what remains beneath the other shell middens of the region? The ones that have not been fully excavated, the ones that have been partially destroyed by development. The ones that sit beneath the water of the modern Everglades. The answer, researchers believe, is a great deal. The archaeological potential of the Everglades region is in many ways still largely untapped. Environmental conditions that make field work difficult also create exceptional preservation. The very water that conceals the evidence also protects it. Beneath the surface of the modern Everglades, within the peat and the shell and the waterlogged sediment, the record of thousands of years of human life continues to rest, quietly, patiently, waiting. One more aspect of the ancient human landscape deserves attention before we move forward: the dead. All human cultures have ways of treating their dead. Burial practices, funeral rituals, the places chosen for interment. These are among the most culturally significant behaviors that archaeologists study, because they reflect deep beliefs about life, death, identity, and the relationship between the living and those who have passed. In southern Florida, archaeologists have documented a range of burial practices associated with the Calusa, the Tequesta, and earlier peoples. Some burials are found within the shell middens themselves, placed in the accumulated material of the community's daily life, surrounded by the refuse of the world they inhabited. Others are found in dedicated burial areas, sometimes on the margins of settlements or in specific elevated locations. Some burial sites in southern Florida show evidence of practices that researchers interpret as indicating beliefs about the persistence of the person after death. The careful arrangement of bones, the inclusion of objects, the use of red ochre pigment. At wet sites, locations where the burial occurred in waterlogged conditions, the preservation can be extraordinary. Soft tissue does not normally survive thousands of years, but in the peat and sediment of Florida's wetlands, some organic material has been found in states of remarkable preservation. One site in particular, Windover Pond, in Brevard County on Florida's east coast, not far from the edge of the Everglades region, produced one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Florida's history. Excavations at Windover in the 1980s recovered the remains of more than 160 individuals buried in a peat pond approximately 8,000 years ago. The preservation was extraordinary. In many cases, brain tissue survived within the skulls, preserved by the peat and the waterlogged conditions. DNA extracted from this tissue provided some of the earliest and most detailed genetic information about ancient North Americans ever obtained. The Windover site is a reminder of what lies beneath the surface of Florida's wetlands, not always dramatic, not always immediately visible, but present, layered within the sediment and the peat, preserved by conditions that exist nowhere else. A record of human life extending back thousands of years, waiting for the careful attention of researchers who know how to read it. The first Spanish ships appeared off the coast of Florida in the early 16th century. The exact date of first contact between Europeans and the peoples of southern Florida is not certain. Spanish explorers were moving through the Caribbean from the late 1490s onward, and Florida's coastline would have been visible and perhaps briefly visited during that early period of exploration. The name Florida itself, likely derived from the Spanish word for flowers, or from the feast of Pascua Florida, the Feast of Flowers, which coincides with Easter, was given to the peninsula by Juan Ponce de Leon, who made a documented landing on the Florida coast in 1513. Ponce de Leon's landing was not a peaceful introduction. The accounts of early Spanish contact with the Calusa describe a people who were deeply suspicious of European intentions, and with good reason. The Spanish presence in the Caribbean had already brought violence, disease, and enslavement to the indigenous peoples of those islands. The Calusa, who had extensive trade and communication networks across the Florida Straits and into the Caribbean, may well have heard accounts of what the Spanish had done elsewhere before any Spanish ship appeared off their coast. What is documented in the historical record is that the Calusa resisted Spanish contact forcefully and consistently for more than a century and a half. When Ponce de Leon attempted to land on the southwest Florida coast in 1513, he was met with hostility. A second expedition in 1521 ended when Ponce de Leon was wounded by an arrow during an encounter with the Calusa, a wound that proved fatal after he returned to Cuba. The man who had named Florida died as a result of his attempt to establish a colony there, turned back by a people who had decided, clearly and collectively, that they did not want what the Spanish were offering. This resistance was not simply aggressive, it was strategic. The Calusa paramount chief, known in Spanish accounts by the title Carlos, a name given by the Spanish that may have been a rough rendering of a Calusa term, maintained a sophisticated political position relative to the Spanish for decades. He negotiated, he accepted gifts. He made tactical concessions, and he consistently refused the things that mattered most to the Spanish: submission to the Spanish crown and conversion to Christianity. The Spanish wanted a converted subject population. The Calusa wanted trade goods and an equal relationship or no relationship at all. The tension between these positions defined the contact period in southwestern Florida for generations. The Spanish accounts of the Calusa, fragmentary, biased by their authors' perspectives and purposes, but still containing genuine observational detail, provide a picture of a functioning, complex society in the 16th and early 17th centuries that is extraordinarily valuable to researchers. The descriptions of Calusa villages, including the paramount village that the Spanish identified as the center of Calusa power, speak of large buildings, organized community spaces, and a population that impressed even observers who arrived with cultural assumptions about what constituted civilization. The Calusa leader had a house large enough, according to one Spanish account, to hold 2,000 people standing. Whether that number is accurate or an exaggeration is impossible to say with certainty. But the impression the building made on its Spanish visitors, people who were accustomed to the architecture of Europe and the Caribbean, was clearly significant. Archaeological research at Mound Key, as we have already touched on, has produced evidence consistent with very large structures. The distribution of post molds, the stained areas in the soil left by the decomposition of wooden posts at Mound Key suggests buildings of a scale that would have been visually impressive and functionally important. The labor required to construct such buildings, in an environment where every piece of dry land was either naturally elevated or artificially built up from shell, speaks to a community with significant organizational capacity and social cohesion. The Spanish also described Calusa religious practices, though their descriptions are filtered through the lens of Catholic missionaries who interpreted what they saw in terms of their own theological framework. The Calusa appear to have had a complex religious system involving beliefs about the soul, about the role of animals in spiritual life, and about the relationship between the living and the dead. They had specialists, individuals with specific religious roles, and they had structured ceremonial practices that the Spanish found deeply unsettling and that became the primary justification for missionary activity in the region. The Jesuit missionaries who arrived on the southwest Florida coast in 1566 stayed for less than a year. Several were killed. The survivors departed and did not return. Franciscan missionaries made subsequent attempts. These also largely failed. The Calusa's resistance to Christianity was not simply stubbornness or aggression. It was, from their perspective, a rational response to a set of demands that would have required the dismantling of their entire cultural and spiritual framework. The Spanish were not offering a supplement to Calusa life. They were demanding its replacement. The Calusa refused. But the Spanish brought something with them that no amount of political skill or military resistance could turn away. Disease. The epidemic diseases of Europe and Africa, smallpox, measles, influenza, and others, had no equivalent in the Americas before European contact. The indigenous peoples of the continent had no prior exposure to these pathogens, and therefore no immunological preparation for them. When these diseases arrived, they moved through indigenous populations with catastrophic speed and mortality. The Calusa population at the time of first European contact is estimated by researchers at somewhere between 10,000 and 50,000 people. Though all such estimates carry significant uncertainty, given the difficulty of reconstructing pre-contact population sizes from the available evidence. By the early 18th century, barely 2 centuries after first sustained contact, the Calusa had been reduced to a tiny fraction of their former numbers. The causes were multiple and overlapping. Disease was the primary factor, but it was not the only one. Spanish slave raids on Florida's indigenous population, taking people to work in Spanish colonial operations elsewhere in the Caribbean, reduced numbers and disrupted communities. Conflict with Spanish forces, though the Calusa generally held their own in direct confrontations, took a toll over time. And beginning in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, a new threat emerged from the north. Creek and other indigenous peoples from what is now Georgia and Alabama, disrupted by the violence and displacement of the colonial frontier further north, began moving into Florida. Some of these groups, who would eventually come to be known collectively as the Seminole, a word derived from a term meaning roughly people who camp at a distance, or wild people, used first by the Creek themselves, arrived in Florida in significant numbers during the 18th century. The Calusa, decimated by disease and under pressure from multiple directions, largely disappeared as a distinct political and cultural entity by the mid-18th century. A small group of survivors, possibly the last remnant of the Calusa people, is recorded as having been evacuated to Cuba by the Spanish around 1763, when Spain ceded Florida to Britain under the terms of the Treaty of Paris. Whether any Calusa descendants survive today and what their story was after that departure is not fully known. The Tequesta experienced a similar trajectory. Their population declined sharply under the pressure of disease and colonial disruption, and by the 18th century, they too had largely ceased to exist as a distinct cultural and political community. The world that the Calusa and Tequesta had built, the shell mounds, the canals, the carefully managed water environments, the trade networks, the ceremonial life did not disappear entirely. It was absorbed into the landscape, buried beneath vegetation and sediment, gradually reclaimed by the water and the earth. And it waited. The Seminole and Miccosukee peoples, who entered Florida primarily during the 18th century and established themselves across the peninsula, including in and around the Everglades, represent a distinct chapter in the human history of this landscape. The Seminole were not a single, unified people with a single origin. They were a confederation, a gathering of people from multiple southeastern indigenous nations, including Creek, Miccosukee, Yuchi, and others, along with formerly enslaved African people who had escaped bondage in the colonial South and found refuge in Florida. This diversity is part of what makes the Seminole story so complex and so important. They arrived in Florida during a period of significant colonial disruption, and they made the landscape of Florida their own in ways that drew on both their own cultural traditions and their responses to the environment they found. The Everglades, in particular, became central to the Seminole experience in Florida during the 19th century, between 1817 and 1858. The United States government fought 3 wars against the Seminole people in Florida, conflicts now known collectively as the Seminole Wars, in an attempt to remove the Seminole from Florida and relocate them to what is now Oklahoma. As part of the broader policy of Indian removal that affected indigenous peoples across the eastern United States during that period, the Everglades saved the Seminole, not metaphorically, literally. The vast, difficult, waterlogged interior of southern Florida, incomprehensible to most United States Army officers and impossible to navigate without intimate local knowledge, became the refuge that allowed a portion of the Seminole people to resist removal. They retreated into the deeper reaches of the Everglades, living on elevated ground within the wetlands, moving by canoe through the shallow water channels, sustaining themselves from the biological richness of the wetland environment. The United States military, despite enormous investment of resources and lives, was ultimately unable to find and defeat the Seminole people in the Everglades. The Third Seminole War ended in 1858, not with a Seminole surrender, but with a withdrawal of United States forces. A few hundred Seminole people, estimates vary, but the numbers were small, remained in the Everglades, never having been removed, never having signed a treaty with the United States government. Their descendants are the Seminole tribe of Florida and the Miccosukee tribe of Indians of Florida, both federally recognized tribes whose members continue to live in and around the Everglades today. The knowledge that the Seminole and Miccosukee people accumulated about the Everglades, about its water, its animals, its plants, its seasons, its dangers and its generosities, is itself a kind of hidden world. It is knowledge built over generations of intimate relationship with a landscape that most outsiders found impenetrable. And it is knowledge that has, in recent decades, increasingly been recognized by scientists and conservationists as invaluable to the understanding and restoration of the Everglades ecosystem. We will return to that recognition later in this journey. For now, we need to follow the Everglades into the period that changed it most dramatically, the era of drainage and development. The transformation of the Everglades began in earnest in the second half of the 19th century. It was driven by a simple and, to its proponents, entirely reasonable idea. The Everglades was wet. Wet land could not be farmed. Farming required dry land. Therefore, the Everglades should be drained. This reasoning applied across enormous areas of wetland throughout North America and around the world during the 19th and early 20th centuries, reflected the dominant perspective of that era toward natural landscapes. That wilderness was waste, that water on land was a problem to be solved. That the proper relationship between human civilization and the natural world was one of management and conversion. Florida's territorial and then state government actively promoted the drainage of the Everglades as a development strategy from the 1840s onward. Land was sold, sometimes fraudulently, to buyers who did not realize they were purchasing land that was permanently underwater, with the promise that drainage would convert it into productive farmland. The actual work of large-scale drainage began in the late 19th century and accelerated dramatically in the early 20th century with the establishment of the Everglades Drainage District in 1907. Canals were dug, not the subtle, carefully placed canals of the ancient Calusa, but massive industrial waterways cut by dredges through the limestone and peat, designed to move water off the land and into the sea as quickly as possible. Dikes were built. Pumping stations were installed. Water that had previously flowed slowly south across the entire breadth of the Everglades was increasingly intercepted, directed, and removed. The results were dramatic. Large areas of former wetland did indeed become dry enough to farm. The sugar industry, in particular, expanded enormously in the area just south of Lake Okeechobee, the great shallow lake at the northern end of the Everglades system, as the land was drained and converted to agricultural use. Vegetable farming spread across other areas of former wetland. Urban development expanded along both coasts, but the drainage also caused damage that was not immediately visible and took decades to fully understand. The peat soils that had accumulated over thousands of years in the drained areas began to oxidize, to literally burn away, exposed to the air for the first time in millennia. The surface of the drained land subsided, in some areas by several feet, over the course of decades. Areas that had been drained to agricultural use found themselves sinking toward or even below sea level, requiring ever more intensive pumping to keep the water out. The water quality in the remaining wetlands deteriorated as agricultural runoff, carrying fertilizers, particularly phosphorus, entered the Everglades system. Sawgrass, which is adapted to the naturally very low nutrient water of the Everglades, was replaced in some areas by cattail, which thrives in higher nutrient conditions. The biological balance of the ecosystem was disrupted. The populations of wading birds, herons, egrets, ibises, spoonbills, which had once gathered in the Everglades in numbers that astonished early observers, declined catastrophically. Some species lost more than 90% of their population. The alligators, the fish, the turtles, and the dozens of other species that depended on the seasonal rhythms of the Everglades water system all felt the effects of a landscape that was no longer behaving according to its ancient patterns. And beneath the surface, the drainage and development also caused a different kind of damage. The archaeological record began to disappear. Shell middens that had been preserved for centuries or millennia by the waterlogged conditions of the Everglades were, when drained and exposed, subject to rapid deterioration. The acidic peat dried and oxidized. The organic materials within it decomposed. The wooden objects, the plant remains, the fragile organic traces of ancient life, all of this was vulnerable to the air in ways it had never been vulnerable to the water. Some mounds were deliberately destroyed, bulldozed for development, used as fill material for roads, quarried for the shell that could be used in construction. The shell of Florida's ancient middens is, quite literally, incorporated into some of Florida's modern roads. The loss was enormous and largely irreversible. What remained, what was not destroyed, sank deeper into the landscape, protected, paradoxically, by the very water that drainage projects were trying to remove. The scientific study of the Everglades, as a system, as a landscape, as an object of research, developed gradually across the late 19th and 20th centuries. Early naturalists and explorers produced accounts of the Everglades that mixed genuine observation with the cultural biases of their time. They saw a wilderness, an untamed, difficult, sometimes threatening environment, rather than a complex ecosystem operating according to its own deep logic. The shift toward a more scientific understanding came from multiple directions. Botanists began systematic surveys of Everglades plant communities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Zoologists documented the extraordinary variety of animal life, the birds, the reptiles, the fish, the mammals that depended on the wetlands. Geologists mapped the limestone bedrock and began to understand the relationship between the surface landscape and the underlying aquifer, and archaeologists began to excavate. The work of Frank Hamilton Cushing at Key Marco in 1896, which we have already discussed, was one of the earliest systematic archaeological excavations in the region. It demonstrated, with extraordinary clarity, the depth and richness of the archaeological record preserved in the waterlogged conditions of the southwestern Florida coast. Subsequent decades brought more excavations at shell mounds along the Gulf Coast, at sites in the interior, at coastal locations. Researchers, including John Goggin, who conducted extensive surveys of Florida archaeological sites in the mid-20th century, began to build a framework for understanding the sequence of cultures that had occupied the Everglades region over time. The development of radiocarbon dating in the late 1940s transformed Florida archaeology, as it transformed archaeology everywhere. For the first time, researchers could attach actual calendar dates to organic materials recovered from excavations, charcoal, bone, shell, wood, and build a chronology of occupation that was grounded in physics rather than inference alone. Radiocarbon dating confirmed what the stratigraphy of many sites had suggested, that human occupation of the Everglades region extended back far further than 19th century observers had imagined, and that the cultural sequence was more complex and varied than early frameworks had proposed. The development of palynology, the study of ancient pollen, added another dimension to the scientific reconstruction of the Everglades past. Researchers extracting sediment cores from lakes, ponds, and peat deposits within and around the Everglades found, within the microscopic pollen grains preserved in those cores, a record of vegetation change extending back thousands of years. That record told a story of dramatic environmental change. It showed the transition from the drier, more open Pleistocene landscape, with its different mix of plant species, to the wetter, warmer conditions of the Holocene and the gradual development of the wetland communities that define the modern Everglades. It showed periods of drought when the water table dropped and fire moved through the landscape. It showed periods of greater wetness when the wetlands expanded. And it showed, in the most recent layers, the dramatic changes associated with European arrival and subsequent development, changes in vegetation composition, spikes in charcoal indicating increased fire, and the signature of introduced plant species. The peat cores are, in a sense, the autobiography of the Everglades, a continuous, unedited record of change extending back to the landscape's origins, written in the microscopic remains of plants and preserved beneath the surface of the water. The technology that has most transformed Everglades archaeology and environmental science in recent decades is, perhaps surprisingly, not something that involves digging at all. It is remote sensing. The ability to gather detailed information about the landscape from a distance, through aerial photography, satellite imaging, and most recently through LiDAR, has opened up new ways of seeing the hidden world beneath the Everglades that would have been impossible with traditional survey methods alone. LiDAR, in particular, has been revolutionary. The technology works by firing millions of laser pulses from an aircraft toward the ground and measuring the time it takes for each pulse to return. By analyzing the pattern of returns, the technology can construct an extraordinarily detailed three-dimensional model of the terrain, including, in vegetated areas, the terrain beneath the vegetation canopy. In most landscapes, vegetation is one of the primary obstacles to archaeological survey. Trees, shrubs, and ground cover conceal the surface and make it impossible to see subtle features, slight rises, shallow depressions, linear anomalies that might indicate ancient human activity. Archaeologists working in forested or vegetated environments traditionally have to cut transects, clear areas, or rely on the limited perspective available from the ground. LiDAR removes that obstacle. When LiDAR data from the Everglades region and the adjacent coastal areas is processed and analyzed, the landscape that emerges beneath the vegetation is often startlingly different from what the surface suggests. Features that are completely invisible from the ground or from conventional aerial photography become apparent in the LiDAR imagery. Subtle ridges in the terrain, linear features that maintain a consistent direction over long distances, elevated platforms that do not correspond to any natural geological explanation. Some of these features have been identified as likely archaeological in nature, consistent with the kinds of modifications platform construction, canal digging, mound building, that we know the Calusa and their predecessors undertook. Others remain ambiguous. Distinguishing between a natural geological feature and an ancient human construction in a landscape as geologically complex as the Everglades requires ground verification, actual physical examination of the feature, and that is often difficult, expensive, and time-consuming in an environment of shallow water, thick vegetation, and difficult access. But LIDAR has already changed the scale at which researchers can think about the ancient human landscape of the Everglades. Instead of understanding individual sites in isolation, researchers can now begin to see the relationships between sites, the way they are distributed across the terrain, the way they relate to water channels and elevated ground, the patterns that emerge when you look at the landscape as a whole rather than one excavation at a time. And what emerges from that broader view is a landscape that is far more thoroughly modified by ancient human activity than most people, including most researchers, would have imagined a generation ago. The science of reconstructing the Everglades past is not confined to archaeology. Hydrologists studying the historical flow patterns of the Everglades have worked to reconstruct, from a combination of historical records, vegetation surveys, sediment analysis, and modeling, what the water system looked like before the drainage era began. This reconstruction has been essential to one of the most ambitious environmental restoration efforts in American history, the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, known by its initials as CERP, which was authorized by the United States Congress in 2000 and represents a multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar effort to restore something closer to the natural hydrology of the Everglades. The central challenge of Everglades restoration is that you cannot simply undo the drainage. The population of South Florida, millions of people, living in cities and suburbs that cover land that was once wetland, depends on the water management infrastructure that the drainage era created. The agriculture south of Lake Okeechobee cannot simply be returned to wetland without enormous economic and social consequences. The infrastructure of canals, dikes, and pumping stations cannot simply be removed. What restoration efforts have attempted instead is to work within the modified system to restore as much of the natural flow as possible, to reconnect water bodies that have been separated to allow water to move more naturally through parts of the landscape, to reduce the nutrient loading that has disrupted the biological balance of the wetlands. The results so far have been mixed, but there are genuine successes. Water flow has been improved in some areas. Some wading bird populations have partially recovered. Some habitats that had been degraded have shown signs of improvement. But the scientific understanding of what the natural Everglades was actually like, what its water levels were, how its flow varied seasonally and from year to year, what its vegetation patterns were before drainage, is essential to knowing what restoration should aim for. And that scientific understanding depends, in significant part, on the hidden world beneath the surface, on the peat layers and their pollen records, on the sediment cores and their chemical signatures, on the archaeological sites and their evidence of human interaction with a functioning, pre-drainage ecosystem. On the karst geology and its role in water movement. On the aquifer and its relationship to the surface wetlands. The science of the past, in other words, is not simply an academic exercise. It is the foundation for understanding what the Everglades was, what it has become, and what it might still be. There is one more layer to the hidden world beneath the Everglades that belongs in this chapter, one that connects the ancient landscape to the modern world in a way that is both scientifically important and quietly moving. Mercury. The Everglades has, for several decades, been known to have unusually high levels of mercury in its water and in the tissues of its animals, particularly in fish, birds, and alligators at the top of the food chain. The mercury enters the Everglades system primarily through atmospheric deposition. It falls with rain, having entered the atmosphere from industrial sources, including coal-burning power plants. In the low oxygen, waterlogged conditions of the Everglades, mercury is converted by bacteria into methylmercury, a form that is highly bioavailable and that accumulates in living tissues as it moves up the food chain. The result is that animals at the top of the Everglades food web, including the Florida panther, which eats prey that has accumulated mercury from the water, have body burdens of mercury that are among the highest recorded for any wild population anywhere in the world. The Florida panther, one of the most endangered mammals in the United States, is fighting a survival battle in which invisible chemistry is one of the enemies. This is not a geological story in the same sense as the limestone and the aquifer. But it is part of the hidden world beneath the Everglades, a story of what has been added to the landscape by modern human activity, accumulating beneath the surface of the water and within the tissues of living things. Just as the peat and the sediment and the archaeological evidence accumulated over thousands of years before, the Everglades stores what it receives. It always has. The limestone holds water. The peat holds pollen and bone and charcoal. The sediment holds the chemical signatures of changing environments. And the water now holds mercury, a modern addition to a very ancient archive. There is a particular hour in the Everglades, the hour just before dawn, when the landscape seems to hold its breath. The darkness is not complete. A faint luminescence comes off the water, a reflection of stars or the beginning glow of a sky not yet ready to lighten. The sawgrass stands perfectly still. The surface of the water is unmarked. Somewhere far away, an anhinga shifts on a cypress branch. A frog calls once and stops, and then there is only the sound that is not quite silence, the soft, continuous presence of a landscape that is alive in ways that are mostly invisible. It is in moments like this that the Everglades reveals something about itself that no map or scientific paper quite captures. It is patient, not in any mystical sense, simply in the literal sense that the Everglades operates on timescales that dwarf the human experience of time. The limestone beneath it formed over millions of years. The aquifer filled slowly over thousands of years of rainfall moving through the rock. The peat accumulated layer by layer across millennia. The water that moves slowly across the surface today has been moving across southern Florida in one form or another for longer than any human civilization has existed anywhere on Earth. This final part of our journey is not about new discoveries or unanswered questions. It is about what all of this means, about what the layers beneath the Everglades, taken together, tell us about time and landscape and the relationship between human beings and the world they inhabit. It is about coming to rest in the deep history of this place. Let us descend one more time through the layers. At the very surface, the water moves. Barely, almost imperceptibly, but it moves, carrying dissolved minerals, microscopic organisms, pollen grains, and particles of organic matter southward toward the sea. It has been doing this, in varying amounts and at varying speeds, for thousands of years. The direction has not changed. The fundamental character of the movement has not changed. What has changed are the quantities, the timing, the chemistry, and the boundaries, all altered by the drainage projects and the water management infrastructure of the past century and a half. But the impulse of the water, its southward inclination, its tendency to spread rather than channel, its relationship to the flat limestone surface beneath it, that is ancient. Beneath the water, the roots of the sawgrass reach into a mat of accumulated organic material, living plants growing from the remains of dead ones, layer upon layer. Some of this root mat is relatively recent. Some of it has been accumulating since before the first European ship appeared on the Florida horizon. The boundary between the living plant and the dead organic material beneath it is not a clean line. It is a gradient, a slow transition from the green and growing world above to the preserved world below, and beneath the root mat, the peat. In some areas of the Everglades, the peat deposits are shallow, a foot or two, representing perhaps 1,000 years of accumulation. In other areas, particularly in the deeper sloughs and interior basins, peat deposits extend much further down, representing several thousand years of continuous wetland conditions. The deepest peat layers in the Everglades are windows into the earliest period of the modern wetlands formation. The time, roughly 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, when the rising seas and warming climate first created conditions wet enough to sustain the kind of ecosystem we recognize today. Within those deep peat layers, the record is extraordinary. Pollen from plants that no longer grow in the same proportions. Spores from fungi that respond to specific environmental conditions. The siliceous remains of diatoms, microscopic algae whose shells preserve information about the chemistry of the water they lived in. Microscopic charcoal particles from ancient fires, and occasionally, in the right conditions, fragments of organic material, seeds, plant stems, insect remains that have survived intact for thousands of years in the low-oxygen environment of the waterlogged peat. Each of these microscopic records, taken together and interpreted carefully, allows researchers to reconstruct not just what the Everglades looked like at a particular point in time, but how it functioned, how wet it was, how the water moved, what lived in it, what burned, what changed. It is, in the most literal sense, reading the landscape, and beneath the peat, the limestone. The limestone of southern Florida is not a simple, uniform material. It comes in several distinct formations, laid down at different periods, with different characteristics and different relationships to the water that moves through them. The uppermost layer of limestone in the Everglades region, the rock that sits just below the soil and peat across much of the landscape, is known as Miami limestone in the southeastern part of the region and as Fort Thompson Formation and other units in other areas. These rocks formed in warm, shallow seas and coastal environments during the Pleistocene epoch, the period from about 2.5 million years ago to approximately 12,000 years ago, when sea levels fluctuated repeatedly as glaciers advanced and retreated in the northern parts of the world. The Miami limestone is a fascinating rock. It contains fossils of the animals and plants that lived in the warm Pleistocene seas of southern Florida, corals, mollusks, sea urchins, and other marine organisms. It also contains, in some areas, fossils of freshwater organisms, snails and other creatures that lived in freshwater or brackish environments during periods when sea levels were lower and the land was exposed. These fossils tell a story of repeated oscillation, of land that was periodically submerged and periodically dry, responding to the great breathing rhythm of the ice ages. The surface of the Miami limestone, where it is exposed or sits just below the peat, is often marked by a distinctive pattern of solution holes and pinnacles, small pits and protrusions created by the slow dissolution of the rock by slightly acidic water over thousands of years. This sculpted surface, known locally as pinnacle rock or solution rock, creates a microtopography of extraordinary complexity: tiny basins that hold water, tiny ridges that remain slightly drier, creating a mosaic of miniature environments that supports an equally complex mosaic of plant communities. This is the hidden architecture of the Everglades surface, invisible beneath the water and the vegetation, but structuring the landscape in ways that are fundamentally important to how the ecosystem functions. Below the Miami limestone, deeper in the rock column, lie older formations, the Tamiami Formation, the Hawthorne Group, and ultimately the ancient Floridan Platform itself, the deep foundation of Florida limestone that extends far below the surface and connects through the aquifer to the broader geological history of the southeastern United States. These deeper formations are not the Everglades in any surface sense. They are the foundation, the rock upon which everything above them rests, and through which the water that sustains the Everglades moves in darkness. Water is the true protagonist of this story, not the Calusa, though they were remarkable, not the limestone, though it is ancient, not the peat, though it carries within it the most intimate record of the landscape's history, not the scientists, though their work has recovered so much of what was hidden. Water. Water falling as rain across the broad watershed of southern Florida. Water accumulating in Lake Okeechobee, that great, shallow, ancient lake at the northern end of the system, fed by the Kissimmee River and dozens of smaller streams, and from there, historically, spilling southward in a broad, slow sheet across the landscape. Water moving through the limestone in darkness, following channels and cavities that have been opening and widening for millions of years. Water rising in springs, cold and clear and constant. Water evaporating from the surface of the wetlands back into the atmosphere, forming the clouds that will fall again as rain. The Everglades is, in a sense, a water machine. It takes the rainfall of the wet season, the dramatic afternoon thunderstorms of the Florida summer, the bands of rain carried by tropical systems, and spreads it slowly, evenly, southward across the landscape, releasing it gradually into the coastal waters of Florida Bay and the Gulf of Mexico. It moderates the extremes. It holds water during the wet season and releases it slowly during the dry. It recharges the aquifer. It nourishes the coastal mangrove forests and the shallow marine environments that depend on the fresh water flowing from the land. Or it did all of this before the drainage era altered the timing and distribution and volume of that water flow. What the restoration effort is trying to recover, more than any specific habitat or any particular species, is the timing. The Everglades ecosystem evolved in response to a specific pattern of water availability, a wet season and a dry season, with the water level rising and falling according to a rhythm that the living things of the ecosystem came to depend upon. Wading birds time their nesting to the dry season, when falling water levels concentrate fish into pools that make feeding efficient. Fish move into the flooded wetlands during the wet season to feed and reproduce in the shallow, vegetated water. Alligators build their nests at specific water levels. Sawgrass and other wetland plants have life cycles calibrated to this annual rhythm. When the drainage infrastructure disrupted the timing, holding water back when the ecosystem needed it to fall, releasing it quickly when the ecosystem needed it to rise slowly, sending it to the sea before the wetlands could absorb it, the rhythm broke. The restoration effort is, in essence, an attempt to restore a rhythm, and understanding what that rhythm was before the canals, before the dikes, before the pumping stations, requires reading the hidden record of the landscape, the peat layers, the sediment cores, the pollen records. The archaeological sites that tell us where people lived and how the water behaved around them. The past is not simply history here, it is a blueprint. There is a concept in ecology and earth science called deep time, a term for the vast spans of time that geological and evolutionary processes operate across, timescales so large that the human imagination struggles to hold them clearly. The limestone beneath the Everglades records deep time. When you stand in the Everglades and look at the pale rock exposed along a trail edge or visible beneath the clear water of a spring, rock full of the fossils of creatures that lived in a vanished sea, you are looking at evidence of processes that operated over millions of years. The accumulation of those shell fragments, the compression into rock, the slow dissolution by water, the emergence of the land from the sea, the successive flooding and exposure as ice ages came and went. These processes continue. The aquifer is still slowly dissolving the limestone from within. The sinkholes that occasionally open in Florida are not anomalies. They are the normal, ongoing operation of a karst landscape working on its own timetable. The coastline is still changing, more rapidly now, as sea levels rise again in response to a warming climate that echoes, in its own accelerated way, the warming that ended the last ice age and created the Everglades. Researchers studying sea level rise in southern Florida have noted something of profound consequence. Much of the freshwater Everglades sits barely above sea level. As the ocean rises, saltwater intrudes into the coastal areas of the wetlands, pushing inland along the limestone and through the shallow soils. Mangroves, which can tolerate brackish water, migrate inland as salt conditions expand. Freshwater sawgrass communities, which cannot tolerate salt, contract. The line between the freshwater Everglades and the tidal zone moves inland year by year. This process has happened before. The geological record preserved in the sediment layers of southern Florida shows previous periods of sea level rise. The same kind of oscillation, driven by ice age cycles that we have already described. The landscape responded to those previous rises by changing, coastal communities moving inland, freshwater areas contracting, the balance between different environments shifting. The difference now is the rate. The sea level changes associated with natural ice age cycles operated over thousands of years. The changes now occurring are happening over decades. The biological communities of the Everglades, the plants, the animals, the soil microbes, the fish, all evolved in response to a relatively stable climate over the past several thousand years. They can adapt, but adaptation takes time. Whether the Everglades, as a recognizable ecosystem, survives the combination of drainage impacts, water quality problems, invasive species, and sea level rise over the coming century, is one of the most pressing and uncertain questions in American conservation. It is not a question that has a simple answer. It is a question that is still being lived. The Seminole and Miccosukee peoples, who have maintained their relationship with the Everglades through all of the disruptions of the past 2 centuries, carry a kind of knowledge that science has taken a long time to fully appreciate. It is not the same kind of knowledge as a sediment core or a LIDAR survey. It is knowledge built from direct relationship, from the accumulated observations of people living within a landscape across many generations, noticing what changes and what stays the same, understanding the connections between things that scientific disciplines often study separately. Traditional ecological knowledge, as it is now referred to in the academic literature, has in recent years been increasingly recognized as a legitimate and valuable form of environmental understanding. It is not a replacement for scientific research. It is a complement to it, a different way of knowing the same landscape, one that often preserves information about conditions and patterns that precede the scientific record. Seminole and Miccosukee knowledge holders have in various contexts and on their own terms shared observations about the Everglades, about the behavior of specific plants and animals, about changes they have noticed over generations, about the relationships between different parts of the ecosystem that have proven consistent with and sometimes ahead of scientific findings. The recognition of this knowledge is not simply about being respectful, though respect is appropriate. It is about being scientifically thorough. The Everglades has been studied intensively by Western science for roughly a century. It has been inhabited and observed by indigenous peoples for at least 10,000 years. The knowledge accumulated over 10,000 years of direct relationship with a landscape is not something that science can afford to ignore. What remains unknown about the hidden world beneath the Everglades is, in some ways, the most important part of this story. Not because mystery is more interesting than knowledge, though there is a quiet pleasure in standing at the edge of the known and looking into the dark, but because the things we do not yet know about the Everglades are precisely the things that matter most for understanding what it is and what it might become. We do not fully understand the underground hydrology, the exact pathways by which water moves through the limestone, the precise relationships between the surface wetlands and the aquifer below, the ways in which changes in one part of the system propagate through the whole. We do not fully understand the ancient human landscape, how many sites remain undiscovered beneath the water and the peat, what the canals and water management features of the ancient Calusa actually looked like at their full extent, what the people who lived in the deep Everglades interior before the Calusa period were doing, and how they organized their lives. We do not fully understand the Pleistocene landscape, the world that existed beneath the modern Everglades before the wetlands formed. The landscape that the first inhabitants of southern Florida walked across, most of which is now either submerged beneath the sea or buried under thousands of years of sediment and peat. We do not fully understand the interactions between climate, sea level, and the Everglades ecosystem, how the wetland will respond to continued change, what thresholds might exist beyond which the system reorganizes into something fundamentally different. What recovery is actually possible given the constraints of a landscape surrounded by one of the most densely populated regions in the southeastern United States. These are not failures of science. They are the natural condition of studying a system this complex, this large, this layered, and this old. The Everglades keeps its secrets not through any kind of intention or resistance. It keeps them simply because it is vast and wet and ancient and deep, and because the tools for reading its hidden record are still being developed and refined and applied. Every decade brings new discoveries. Every new technique, a more sensitive chemical analysis, a more detailed LiDAR survey, a more sophisticated climate model, a more careful archaeological excavation reveals something that was hidden before, and every discovery opens new questions. There is a place in the Everglades, or rather, there are many such places, though not all of them are easy to find, where the water comes up from below, not dramatically, not with any force or sound. Simply a slight upwelling in the bottom of a shallow channel, a place where the water is fractionally cooler and clearer than the surrounding wetland water, a place where the limestone surface below shows the subtle circular dissolution pattern that indicates water moving upward through the rock. These small seeps and springs, most of them modest by any measure, nothing like the great springs of central Florida, are the places where the hidden world and the visible world most directly meet. They are places where the aquifer expresses itself at the surface, where the water that has been moving through limestone in darkness for months or years or longer finally emerges into the light, where the chemistry of the deep rock mingles with the chemistry of the surface wetland, where the boundary between what is seen and what is hidden becomes permeable. Researchers studying these features have found, in the water emerging from them, chemical signatures that carry information about where the water has been, what rocks it has moved through, how long it has been underground, what it has dissolved along the way. This information helps build a picture of the underground water system that is otherwise impossible to observe directly. But there is also something worth noting about these places that is less strictly scientific. They are often places of unusual biological richness. The slight differences in water temperature and chemistry that the seeps create, the fractional cooling, the altered mineral content, the subtle upwelling, attract fish and invertebrates that find the conditions favorable. Vegetation patterns around seep areas sometimes differ from the surrounding wetland in ways that reflect the different water chemistry. The convergence of subsurface and surface worlds, even when it is subtle and quiet, creates conditions that support a slightly different community of living things. The hidden world does not stay entirely hidden. It expresses itself quietly, indirectly, through the behavior of water and the responses of living things, in ways that a careful observer can learn to recognize. The Everglades does not preserve its history in monuments. There is no grand architecture here, no soaring stone columns, no inscribed walls, no visible record of all that has happened in this landscape over the millennia of its existence. The shell mounds of the Calusa are the closest thing to monument that the region offers, and most of them are overgrown, eroded, fragmented, or partially destroyed. A person walking past one without prior knowledge might not recognize it for what it is. The Everglades preserves its history in quieter ways. In the layered peat, carrying within it the pollen of ancient forests and the microscopic remains of creatures that lived in water that looked exactly like this water thousands of years ago. In the limestone, holding within its fossils the memory of seas that vanished long before any human being walked on this land. In the aquifer, carrying water that fell as rain on a landscape that no longer exists, water that has been slowly moving through the rock for longer than any city in the world has been inhabited. In the shell middens, dark and dense and rich, preserving within their layers the evidence of lives lived in intimate relationship with a world that offered extraordinary abundance to those who understood it. In the canals that archaeologists are still mapping, subtle, straight, persistent features in the landscape that speak to generations of careful, organized, intelligent effort to live well within a complex environment. In the oral traditions and living knowledge of the Seminole and Miccosukee peoples, who have maintained their connection to this landscape through everything that has been done to displace them from it. In the sediment cores that researchers extract from lake bottoms and peat deposits, long cylinders of compressed history, each centimeter a record of something that happened and left a trace. In the water itself, moving slowly as it always has, carrying what it carries, dissolving what it dissolves, connecting what is above with what is below. There is something about the Everglades that resists conclusion. Every time you think you have understood it, every time a framework seems to capture its character, every time a research program seems to have answered its central questions, the landscape reveals another layer, another complexity, another dimension that the previous understanding had not accounted for. It is not obstinate, it is simply deep. The visible Everglades, the sawgrass and the open water and the hammocks and the mangrove coast is real, and it is extraordinary in its own right. The birds that gather at dusk over the water, the alligators resting on exposed banks, the fish moving through the shallow channels, the sawgrass bending in the afternoon wind, all of this is genuine and present and worth attention. But it is only the surface. Beneath it lies a world that operates on different timescales, a world of rock and water and accumulated organic material and buried evidence and underground movement that has been building and changing and persisting for millions of years. And within that buried world, interspersed with the geological record and the environmental archive, is the human story, the long-layered, incompletely understood story of the people who found this landscape and made it home, who learned to read its water and navigate its channels, and harvest its abundance and survive within its complexity. The first of them arrived when the landscape was young, when the wetlands were just forming, when the coastline was still adjusting to rising seas, when the animals and plants of a changing world were finding their new equilibrium. They came without knowing what the landscape would become. They built their knowledge from observation and experience and accumulated understanding across generations. And they shaped the landscape even as the landscape shaped them, not dramatically, not in ways that left obvious monuments, but persistently and intelligently over thousands of years. The Calusa built shell islands from the sea. They dug canals through the mangroves. They built large houses on elevated ground and maintained complex political and spiritual lives in the richest estuarine environment in North America. The Tequesta built their principal village at the place where the fresh water of the interior met the salt water of the coast, and they left their marks in the limestone bedrock of what is now a major American city. The Seminole and Miccosukee found in the deep Everglades a refuge that no army could penetrate, and they built within it a way of life that persists to this day. The scientists, the archaeologists, the geologists, the hydrologists, the ecologists, the palynologists have spent the last century and a half learning to read the record that all of these people and all of these processes have left behind. They have found in the peat and the sediment and the shell and the limestone a story far older, far richer, and far more complex than the earliest observers imagined. And the Everglades itself, the water and the rock and the accumulated organic memory of thousands of years, continues to hold far more than has yet been read. The hour before dawn in the Everglades, the water reflects the first pale lightening of the sky. The sawgrass is perfectly still. The surface of the water is unmarked. Beneath your feet, if you are standing in the shallow water of an interior slough, the peat is soft and dark and cold. Beneath the peat, the limestone is riddled with channels and cavities through which water moves in silence. Beneath the limestone, the aquifer holds its vast, patient quantity of water that fell as rain on this landscape long before any of the events described in this documentary took place, water that has been slowly moving through the rock ever since. Somewhere within the peat beneath you, there may be pollen from a tree that no longer grows in this part of Florida, a record of a climate that existed here thousands of years ago, preserved by the water that surrounds it. Somewhere within the sediment, beneath a nearby hammock. There may be the charcoal from a fire that someone built 1,000 years ago. A person who sat beside it in this same landscape, listening to the same birds, watching the same quality of pre-dawn light move across the same water. The connections are not poetic inventions. They are physical realities. The pollen is there. The charcoal is there. The bones and shells and carved wood and accumulated shell of thousands of years of human and biological life are there beneath the water and the peat and the limestone, preserved by conditions that exist nowhere else, waiting for the careful attention of researchers who know how to read them. The hidden world is not a metaphor, it is the Everglades. And as the light slowly comes, as the eastern sky shifts from dark to deep blue to the first thin line of pink above the horizon, as the sawgrass begins to emerge from shadow into the pale flat light of a Florida morning, as the first egret lifts from somewhere in the distance and crosses the brightening sky in a long, slow arc, the water continues to move, barely perceptibly, southward, as it always has, carrying what it carries, covering what it covers, connecting what lies above to what lies below, moving through the landscape with a patience that belongs to geological time, a patience that asks nothing of the observer, expects nothing, accommodates the wading bird and the alligator and the sawgrass and the limestone and the memory of 10,000 years of human life with the same slow, even unhurried generosity. The Everglades does not rush its revelations. It offers them, layer by layer, to those who are willing to be still and patient and attentive enough to receive them. And there is always another layer. There is always more beneath. The hidden world beneath the Everglades. America's forgotten underwater landscape. This has been a History Sleepy Time documentary. The Everglades continue. The water moves. The layers accumulate. And the story rests quietly just beneath the surface.